The man settled into his plush first-class seat, stretching out with a satisfied sigh. He was dressed in designer jeans, a crisp button-down, and an expensive watch that shimmered under the cabin lights. As he scrolled through his phone, he barely noticed the older gentleman taking the seat beside him. The man wore a simple brown jacket, faded jeans, and a weathered hat. His face was lined with age, his hands rough from years of labor. Just another retiree, the younger man thought, probably someone who had cashed out on a lucky investment. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, the younger man leaned over with a smirk. "Didn't expect to see many folks like you up here in first class," he remarked, his voice laced with condescension. The older man glanced at him but said nothing, merely offering a small nod before looking back out the window. Undeterred, the younger man continued. "Let me guess. Lottery win? Maybe you sold a farm? First time flying like this?" He chuckled to himself, shaking his head. "It's always interesting seeing who gets lucky enough to afford this." A woman seated across the aisle, who had been quietly observing, shifted uncomfortably. A flight attendant passing by subtly narrowed her eyes at the remark but kept walking. The older man, however, remained calm. He finally turned to face his seatmate, his sharp blue eyes steady. "Something like that," he said simply. The younger man scoffed. "Figures. Some of us work hard to get up here, you know. Build businesses, make smart investments, that kind of thing." He lifted his glass of champagne in a mock toast. "Welcome to the high life, old-timer." A soft chuckle came from across the aisle. The woman who had been watching couldn't hold back any longer. "You don't recognize him, do you?" she asked, amusement flickering in her eyes. The younger man frowned. "Should I?" The flight attendant, who had been refilling drinks, smirked and set down the bottle. "That old-timer is Clint Eastwood." Silence. The younger man's jaw slackened slightly as he turned back to the man beside him, now suddenly aware of the piercing gaze that had become iconic in film history. His mind scrambled, recalling movies his father had watched. The squint, the low, gravelly voice, the unmistakable presence. Clint Eastwood. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him like a tidal wave. His throat went dry. I didn't realize," he stammered, his arrogance crumbling. Eastwood simply smiled, a knowing, almost amused look in his eyes. "You're not the first," he said, sipping his drink. The younger man swallowed hard, suddenly feeling small in the presence of a Hollywood legend. His bravado was gone, replaced by the realization that he had just insulted one of the most respected actors and directors of all time. The rest of the flight was spent in uneasy silence, the younger man shifting uncomfortably while Eastwood remained, as relaxed as ever. When they landed, the younger man hesitated before mumbling, "Enjoy your trip, Mr. Eastwood." Clint gave him a nod and walked off the plane, his legend intact, leaving the man with nothing but regret and a story he'd never live down. As the younger man sat there, still reeling from his humiliation, the woman across the aisle smirked. "That's a story you'll be telling for the rest of your life, huh?" she teased. He let out a nervous chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, not exactly my proudest moment." The flight crew began guiding passengers off the plane, and as he gathered his belongings, he caught a final glimpse of Eastwood walking through the terminal, moving with a quiet confidence that no amount of money could buy. Determined to salvage some dignity, the younger man pulled out his phone and searched for Clint Eastwood's career highlights. The more he read, the worse he felt. Academy Awards, legendary films, directing masterpieces well into his 90s. This man wasn't just wealthy. He was an icon, a self-made success story who had earned his place in history. As he exited the gate, he spotted Eastwood standing near a chauffeur holding a discreet sign with his name. Before he could overthink it, he strode up to him. "Mr. Eastwood," he said hesitantly. Clint turned, raising an eyebrow but saying nothing. "I just wanted to apologize. I was an idiot on the plane. Didn't realize who I was talking to." Eastwood studied him for a moment, then gave a slight nod. Takes guts to admit when you're wrong, he said. That's a start. Feeling both relieved and humbled, the younger man stuck out his hand. Name's Jason, by the way. Clint shook it firmly. Good luck, Jason. With that, he turned and walked toward his car, disappearing into the city, leaving Jason with a lesson he wouldn't forget. Respect isn't about wealth or status. It's about character. As Jason stood there watching Clint Eastwood disappear into the sea of travelers, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed paths with something greater than fame or fortune. He had insulted a man who had built his legacy on sheer grit, talent, and determination. A man who had seen and done more in one lifetime than Jason could even fathom. With a sigh, he adjusted his expensive watch, suddenly feeling like it didn't mean much. Money had always been his measure of success, but Clint Eastwood had just reminded him that true success was something deeper, something earned, not just bought. As he walked toward baggage claim, Jason pulled out his phone again. This time, instead of checking his stock portfolio or social media, he searched for Eastwood's most famous quotes. One, in particular, stood out. Respect your efforts, respect yourself. Self-respect leads to self-discipline. When you have both under your belt, that's real power. He let the words sink in. Maybe it was time to reevaluate a few things. A few days later, Jason found himself sitting at his favorite high-end bar, the kind where people flaunted their success with overpriced drinks and designer suits. He overheard a man at the next table, talking down to an older gentleman about his simple attire, much like Jason had done on the plane. The arrogance in the man's voice made Jason cringe. It was a mirror reflecting back at him, showing him exactly what he used to be. Jason leaned over and, for the first time in a long time, spoke with sincerity rather than ego. You might want to be careful who you judge, he said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has done more than you'll ever dream of. The man scoffed, but the older gentleman simply gave Jason a knowing smile. Jason smirked to himself. He'd learned his lesson the hard way, but maybe, just maybe, he could help someone else learn it a little sooner. A few months passed, but Jason never forgot his encounter with Clint Eastwood. Something about it had shaken him, not just the embarrassment of his arrogance, but the realization that he had been measuring success all wrong. He had always judged people by their appearances, their clothes, their cars. But Clint had walked into that first-class cabin looking like an ordinary man and turned out to be a living legend. Determined to change, Jason started making small adjustments. He listened more, talked less. He paid attention to people beyond their surface-level impressions. And most importantly, he stopped assuming he was the smartest or most important person in the room. One evening, he found himself at a networking event full of high-profile investors and entrepreneurs. It was the kind of event where everyone tried to outdo each other with stories of their latest deals, luxury purchases, and exclusive vacations. Jason had once thrived in these circles, but now, something about it felt hollow. As he sipped his drink, he noticed a quiet older man in the corner wearing a simple blazer and slacks. No expensive watch, no flashy attitude, just an easy, confident presence. A younger businessman approached the man, clearly sizing him up, and Jason could tell from the smug look on his face that he was about to make the same mistake Jason had made on that plane. Jason acted on instinct. He walked over just in time to hear the young businessman say, "You in the wrong place, old-timer? These events are for people making moves." Before the older man could reply, Jason stepped in. "Careful," he said, smirking. "That's exactly what I said to Clint Eastwood once. Didn't end well for me." The younger man blinked in confusion. "What?" Jason turned to the older gentleman and extended a hand. "Jason Carter," he introduced himself. "And you are?" The man shook his hand, his grip strong. "Walter Jacobs," he said simply. Jason raised an eyebrow. He knew that name. Walter Jacobs was a self-made billionaire, one of the biggest real estate moguls in the country. He had built his empire from nothing, an old-school businessman who valued hard work and humility over flash and bravado. The younger businessman's face paled as he realized his mistake. Jason chuckled. Lesson number 1. Never judge a book by its cover. Walter Jacobs gave Jason an approving nod. "Seems like you've learned a thing or two." Jason grinned. I had a good teacher. As the night went on, Jason found himself deep in conversation with Walter, soaking up every bit of wisdom the man had to offer. He realized something that night. Success wasn't just about money or power. It was about the way you carried yourself, the way you treated people, and the respect you earned, not demanded. Walking away from the event, Jason couldn't help but think back to Clint Eastwood on that flight. He had been given a lesson in humility that day, and now it was starting to shape his future in ways he never expected. And for the first time in his life, Jason felt like he was finally on the right path. A year had passed since Jason's fateful flight with Clint Eastwood, and in that time he had transformed in ways he never thought possible. His business was still thriving, but his approach had changed. He no longer chased status for the sake of appearances. Instead, he focused on meaningful work, genuine connections, and learning from those who had walked the path before him. One evening, Jason found himself at a charity gala in Los Angeles, an event filled with influential figures, from entertainment, business, and politics. Unlike the past, where he might have spent the night boasting about his latest ventures, Jason was content to observe, listen, and engage in real conversations. As he made his way through the crowd, admiring the classic Hollywood atmosphere, he heard a familiar voice behind him. Well, look who's got himself some manners. Jason turned, and his breath caught for a moment. There, standing with his usual effortless confidence, was Clint Eastwood. The same weathered yet sharp blue eyes, the same calm presence that had once put Jason in his place at 35,000 feet. Jason grinned, a mix of nerves and excitement bubbling up. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, shaking his hand firmly. "Didn't think I'd ever get the chance to see you again." Clint studied him for a moment, then smirked. "You seem different. Less mouthy." Jason chuckled. "That flight was a wake-up call. I needed it." Clint nodded approvingly. "Not everyone takes a lesson like that to heart." They stood there for a moment, the buzz of the gala continuing around them. Jason could hardly believe he was having a second chance to talk with the man he had once insulted. "I have to ask," Jason said after a pause. "You never seemed bothered by what I said that day. You could have put me in my place right then and there." Clint took a sip of his drink and shrugged. "I've met a lot of people in my time. Some talk big, some act small. But the ones who really learn, those are the ones worth waiting on." Jason felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. A year ago, he had been a man obsessed with image and wealth, blind to the things that truly mattered. Now, standing in front of a legend, he realized just how far he had come. "Well," Jason said with a smile, "I'm still learning, but I appreciate the lesson." Clint gave him a small nod, the kind that carried weight far beyond words. "Keep at it." With that, he turned and walked off into the crowd, just like he had that day at the airport. Jason watched him go, knowing this time he wouldn't be left with regret, only gratitude. He had started that journey as the man who insulted Clint Eastwood. Now, he was the man who learned from him. And that made all the difference. As Clint Eastwood disappeared into the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns, Jason stood there, letting the moment sink in. A year ago, he had been just another arrogant businessman, too caught up in his own self-importance to recognize greatness when it sat right next to him. But now he understood the true meaning of success. Shaking his head with a smile, Jason turned back to the bar, ordering himself a whiskey, neat, just like he imagined Clint would. He took a slow sip, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't known before. It wasn't about trying to impress anyone anymore. It was about being the kind of man who earned respect without demanding it. As he set his glass down, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You seem to know Eastwood well." Jason turned to see an older gentleman in a crisp black suit. The man had the aura of someone important, sharp eyes, a measured stance, and an air of quiet authority. Jason recognized him immediately. Richard Harmon, a billionaire investor known for his no-nonsense approach to business. Jason gave a modest chuckle. "I wouldn't say know him well, but he sure taught me a thing or two." Harmon studied him for a moment. That's rare. Most people meet legends and spend the whole time trying to prove themselves. Jason smirked. Yeah, I used to be one of those people. Harmon seemed amused by the answer. Then you might be exactly the kind of person I'm looking for. Jason raised an eyebrow. Oh? Harmon nodded. I need someone who understands people, who knows when to listen instead of just talk. I have a new venture in the works, and I need a partner who values wisdom over flash. You interested? Jason hesitated for just a second, then grinned. Mr. Harmon, I think we should talk. As they stepped away to discuss business, Jason couldn't help but think back to that flight, the moment that had set everything in motion. One insult to Clint Eastwood had nearly made him a fool, but the lesson it taught him had changed his life. Some people learn the hard way. Jason was just grateful he had learned it all. As Jason and Richard Harmon found a quiet corner of the gala to talk, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was another turning point in his life. A year ago, he would have approached this conversation differently, probably trying to dominate the discussion, throwing around his accomplishments to prove his worth. But tonight he simply listened. Harmon leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as he spoke. I'm looking for someone to help lead a new private equity firm. Not just another money-hungry executive, but someone who understands people, someone who's learned when to shut up and pay attention. Jason smirked. I had a hell of a teacher. Harmon chuckled. Eastwood? Jason nodded. Indirectly. He never lectured me. He just let me walk into my own stupidity and figure it out. Harmon took a sip of his drink, watching Jason carefully. That tells me you're the kind of person who doesn't make the same mistake twice. Jason thought about that. Had he truly changed? He had certainly improved, but deep down he knew he still had a long way to go. The difference was, now he was willing to admit it. I try not to, Jason finally said. Harmon smiled, satisfied with the answer. That's all I need to hear. They continued talking, diving into details about the firm, its vision, and how Jason could play a role. By the end of the conversation, Jason knew one thing for certain. This opportunity wasn't just about money. It was about purpose. As they shook hands to seal the beginning of what could be a life-changing partnership, Jason heard another familiar voice behind him. Not bad, kid. He turned to see Clint Eastwood standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, that same unreadable expression on his face. You were listening? Jason asked, surprised. Clint shrugged. You handled yourself well. Jason couldn't help but laugh. You always just pop up at the right moments? Clint smirked. That's what legends do. Jason shook his head with a grin. A year ago, he had been the man who insulted Clint Eastwood. Now, he was the man who had earned his respect, and that was worth more than any first-class seat in the world. Jason stood there taking in the moment. If someone had told him a year ago that Clint Eastwood would be standing in front of him, giving him a nod of approval, he would have laughed in their face. Yet here he was, no longer just a man chasing status, but someone who had truly grown. Clint gave him a final look before turning to leave. Don't screw it up, he said over his shoulder. Jason grinned. I don't plan to. As Clint disappeared into the crowd once more, Jason exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He turned back to Richard Harmon, who was watching him, with amusement. You know, I've seen a lot of people get lucky breaks, Harmon said. Most of them let it go to their heads. You might just be different. Jason smirked. I like to think I'm a work in progress. Harmon nodded, approvingly. Good, because this opportunity isn't about quick wins. It's about long-term vision, discipline, and surrounding yourself with the right people. Jason thought about that. A year ago, he would have dismissed the idea. He had always been about fast results, immediate payoffs. But now, he understood the value of patience, of playing the long game. I'm in, Jason said, shaking Harmon's hand firmly. As the night wore on, Jason found himself reflecting on how much had changed. The man who had once measured success in dollar signs was now measuring it in lessons learned and respect earned. And as he walked out of the gala that night, stepping into the cool Los Angeles air, he realized something. He wasn't just someone who had learned from Clint Eastwood. He was someone who had finally learned to respect himself.